dedicated to my son Sean Anthony Steele, in loving memory of my father Richard Steele.
4. Indeed, O Critias and Hermocrates, I am conscious of my own inability to praise such men in such a city according to their desert. This is the second of the proposed heads, of which we have before assigned the cause, and shall now again explore it according to another method. For now some of the more ancient interpreters have said that the encomiastic form of writing is robust, superb, and magnificent, but the Socratic character of diction is slender, accurate, and dialectic. The latter, therefore, is contrary to the former. Hence, say they, Socrates avoids panegyric, as knowing the power he possessed, and the subjects to which it was naturally adapted. Those, however, who assert this, in addition to their being directly refuted by the Menexenus, appear to me not to have perceived the magnificence of the diction of Socrates in the Phaedrus. There are also those who say it is fit that the artificer of such like encomiums should be skilled in warlike affairs. Hence many historians err in their disposition of armies, through ignorance of tactics. But Socrates, having fought at Delos and Potidæa, was not unskilled in all such like particulars. Others again assert that Socrates speaks ironically, just as he said with respect to other things, that he was ignorant of them. So here he says that he did not know how to praise this city according to its desert. The irony, however, of Socrates was employed against sophists and young men, and not against wise and scientific men. It is better, therefore, instead of these things to say, that he guards against becoming the third from the truth, for the works of a rightly instituted city are the third from the paradigm of truth, that is of the true or intelligible polity. Hence, wishing to remain in the second from the truth, he says, he is not able to bear the descent to the third species of life, and an impotency of this kind is an abundance of power, for to be able to abide in paradigms is effected through power which is transcendent. You may likewise see how this accords with what has been before said by us respecting the analogy of these things to wholes, for the second fabrication is assimilated to the first, and on this account is proximate to it. For the whole demiurgic series is one, possessing union together with separation. Very properly, therefore, is Socrates precedenteously extended to Critias and Hermocrates, and he rightly thinks it fit that they should weave together the particulars that are next in order. For Timaeus is about to deliver these things in a more universal and elevated manner, and not through images, in consequence of directly preserving his analogy to the demiurgus of wholes, who paints the heavens with the dodecahedron, but generation with appropriate figures. Indeed, that I should be incapable of such an undertaking is not wonderful, since the same imbecility seems to have attended poets, both of the past and present age. Not that I despise the poetic genus, but it is perfectly evident that the imitative tribe easily and in the best manner imitate things in which they have been educated. But that which is foreign to the education of any one, it is difficult to imitate well in deeds, and still more difficult in words. This is the third of the before-mentioned heads of discussion, in which Socrates shows that none of the poets have been adequate to the praise of men and cities of this kind, which have casually been engaged in warlike actions. Longinus, however, and Origen, doubt whether Plato comprehends Homer among the poets, when he says that he has not only the same opinion of the poets then existing, for this is nothing novel, but likewise of those of former times, so that Porphyry informs us that Origen passed 3 whole days exclaiming, blushing and toiling, asserting that the hypothesis and the doubt were great, and being ambitious to show that the imitation in the poetry of Homer is sufficient for virtuous actions. For who speaks more magnificently than Homer, who, representing the gods as contending and fighting with each other, does not err in his imitation, but speaks loftily conformably to the nature of things. Porphyry, however, in reply, says that Homer is indeed sufficient to give magnitude and elevation to the passions, and to excite actions to an imaginative bulk, but that he is not capable of delivering an impassivity which is intellectual. and which energizes according to a philosophic life. But I should wonder if Homer is not sufficient for these things, but Critias is, or Hermocrates, and should be thought fit to speak about them. It appears, therefore, to me, that Plato divides poetry into the divinely inspired, and the artificial. 5. And having made this division, he refers the magnificent diction and sublimity derived from inspiration, to the gods, for oracles in the remarkable degree possess grandeur, vehemence, and magnificence of language. But he evinces that the poetry proceeding from human art is not adequate to the praise of the fortitude of this city, and of the great deeds of the men that are educated in it. For if there is any artificial sublimity in some one of the poets, it has much of contrivance in it, and grandeur of diction, and makes great use of metaphors, as is the case with Antimachus. But Socrates requires a panegyrist, who exhibits in his praise a spontaneous sublimity, and a magnificence of language, which is free from compulsion and pure, just as actions, in his Republic, have magnificence, not casually, but adapted to the education and discipline of the men. That Socrates, however, does not reject the divinely inspired poet, nor the whole of poetry, but that only which is artificial, he manifests, I think, when he says that he does not despise the poetic genus. The poetic genus, therefore, is divine, as he elsewhere says, but he despises the imitative species of poetry, nor yet this simply, but that which is nourished in depraved manners and laws. For this, in consequence of verging to things of a less excellent nature, is not naturally adapted to be imitative of more exalted manners, and thus much in answer to the doubt, the last part, however, of the words of Socrates, being in a certain respect difficult, may be rendered perspicuous as follows, but the words are, that which is foreign to the education of any one. It is difficult to imitate well in deeds, and still more difficult in words, for it seems to be easy to imitate words or deeds. Not a few, therefore, act sophistically, by exhibiting virtue as far as words, but in deeds being entirely alienated from it. Will it not, therefore, be better to interpret these words thus, viz. to suppose the most excellent education is implied in the words, that which is foreign to the education of any one, but to assume, in deeds and in words, as equivalent to, conformably to deeds, and conformably to words, and to imitate well, as having the same meaning with to be well imitated, and thus we may collect from all these, that for that which is most excellent to be well imitated, it is difficult indeed according to deeds, but it is still more difficult for it to be well imitated according to words in a written work, for this is the thing proposed to be effected in poetry, and you may see how this accords with things themselves, for he who in a written work narrates the deeds of the most excellent men, composes a history, but he who narrates the speeches of these men, if he intends to preserve the manners of the speaker, assumes a disposition similar to the speaker, for words are seen to differ according to the inward dispositions, for thus we deride most of those, except Plato, who have written the Apology of Socrates, as not preserving the Socratic manner in their composition, though the narration of this very thing, that Socrates was accused, made an apology, and was sentenced to die, would not be thought worthy of laughter, but the dissimilitude of imitation in the composition renders the imitators ridiculous, since, also, to say of Achilles, that he came forth armed after such a manner, and that he performed such deeds, is not difficult, but to narrate copiously what he said, when detained in the river, is not easy. But this is the province of one who is able to assume the manners of the hero, and to write conformably to what he would have said. This also is evident from Socrates in the Republic, very much blaming Homer respecting the imitation of words. But as to the gods, it is said to be easy by language to imitate the words or the deeds of the gods, for who can delineate their works according to their desert? Or it may be said that it is the same thing with respect to the gods, to imitate their words or deeds. For since their words are intellections, and their intellections are productions, the imitator of their words is also the imitator of their productions. so that by how much he fails in the one, by so much also is he deficient in the imitation of the other. Longinus, however, has the following doubts with respect to the proposed words. For if poets are not worthy imitators of the works pertaining to such a city as this, because they are not educated in the manners of the city, neither will Critias and his associates be able to effect this, for neither did they live performing the office of magistrates in it. But if it is because they have not science, but are imitators alone, why by receiving types from us, may they not be able to imitate, since they possess an imitative power? In answer to these doubts, it may be said, that the imitation of such a polity proceeds through a life concordant with its paradigms, for he who does not live according to virtue, is incapable of adducing words adapted to worthy men. It is not, therefore, sufficient merely to hear what form of life the polity possesses, in order to imitate it, as that out of Longinus says it is, but Porphyry adds, that as all things, such for instance as the diurnal light, are not imitated by painters, so neither is the life of the most excellent polity imitated by poets, in consequence of transcending their power. But with respect to the tribe of sophists, though I consider them as skilled both in the art of speaking, and in many other beautiful arts, yet as they have no settled abode, but wander daily through a multitude of cities, I am afraid, lest with respect to the institutions of philosophers and politicians, they should not be able to conjecture the quality and magnitude of those concerns, which wise and politic men are engaged in with individuals in warlike undertakings, both in deeds and words. With respect to the sophists, some of them frequently pretended to be skilled in astronomy, others in geometry, others in politics, and others in the art of dividing. Hence they are now said to be skilled in many beautiful arts. Since, however, they did not possess a scientific knowledge of these, it is added, that they are skilled in them, for skill manifests in irrational occupations in mere words, unaccompanied with the knowledge of the why, because, however, they not only lived at different times and different cities, but were full of deception, of false opinion, and unscientific wandering. They are justly called wanderers, but as they led a disorderly and an erudite life, energizing according to passion, they are very properly said not to have a settled abode, since it is requisite that every one should arrange himself prior to other things, for all such particulars, as are in a family and a city, are likewise in manners, and these prior to externals ought to be fitly governed. Who then are the proper imitators of the deeds and words of the best polity, if neither the poets nor the sophists are? They are such as are both politicians and philosophers, for the union of both these is necessary, in order that through the political character they may be able to perceive the works of the citizens, but through the philosophic, their words, in consequence of inwardly pre-assuming their life, and through the former, indeed, they comprehend their practical wisdom, but through the latter, the intellectual energy of the rulers. But from these images, we should make a transition to demiurgic causes, for it is necessary that these also should be total and intellectual, in order that the universe may be consummately perfect, and that generation may possess iconically such things as the heavens primarily contain. The genus, therefore, of your habit remains, which at one and the same time participates of both these, by nature and by education. Longinus, not disdaining to survey these words, and those that precede them, says, that in that part of them beginning with, but with respect to the tribe of sophists, I am afraid, as they are wanderers, and see there is a difference of expression through the desire of dignity and gravity in the diction, that in the words that follow, lest with respect to the institutions of philosophers and politicians, they should not be able to conjecture the quality and magnitude of those concerns, and see there is a distortion of phrase from what is natural, and that the third part, the genus therefore of your habit remains, and see is perfectly unusual, for it is not at all dissimilar to the strength of Hercules, to the sacred strength of Telemachus, and other such like expressions. But Origen admits, that the form of expression in the proposed words is conformable to the manner of historians, for such like periphrases are adapted to a narration of this kind, as well as to poetry. We, however, say that Plato everywhere changes his mode of diction, so as to be adapted to his subjects, and in unusual things, studies mutations of expression. But we do not admit that the proposed words are periphrases, for they do not manifest the same thing as the expression you, like the strength of Hercules, from which there would only be an ability of giving that which is adapted to the imitation of the best polity. For those who are both philosophers and politicians, by energizing according to the habit which they possess, and which differs from the poetical and sophistical habit, will be able to effect that which Socrates desires, and thus much for the words themselves. Looking, however, to the conceptions which they contain, we must say that Socrates excites Critias and Hermocrates to what remains to be accomplished in the polity, but likewise calls on Timaeus to assist the undertaking, and this is the fifth head of the things proposed for elucidation. You may also see how magnificently Socrates celebrates the men from the very beginning, calling the wisdom which they possess a habit, in order that he may exempt them from sophistical wandering. But he says that they are partakers of the political science, both by nature and education, in order that you may contradistinguish it from poetical imitation, which is nourished by less excellent laws. And he designates the perfect from nature and education, lest depriving nature of education, you should cause it to be lame, or you should think that education ought to be thrown into an unapt and incongruous recipient. And thus much has been said in common respecting the men. But if you wish to speak, proceeding to paradioms, the demiurgic genus, which is total and intellectual, remains to be arranged according to a providential attention to wholes. Let us, however, survey separately every particular, for Timaeus here of Locris, an Italian city, governed by the best of laws, exclusive of his not being inferior to any of his fellow citizens in wealth and nobility, has obtained in his own city the greatest honors, and the highest posts of government, and, in my opinion, has arrived at the summit of all philosophy. What testimony, therefore, can be more admirable than this, or what praise can be greater? Does it not, in the first place, evince that Timaeus was a political character, in the second place, that he possessed intellectual knowledge, in a most eminent degree, by saying that he had arrived at the summit of all philosophy, and adding, in my opinion, which places a colophon on all the panegyrics? What other image also than this among men is more capable of being assimilated to the one demiurgus? For, in the first place, by the political and the philosophic, the image is Jovian. In the next place, by asserting that Timaeus belonged to a city governed by the best of laws, it imitates the god who was nurtured in the intelligible by Adrastia, and by Timaeus excelling in nobility of birth, it adumbrates the total, intellectual, and unical nature of the god. For all these the demiurgus possesses, by participating of the fathers prior to himself, by asserting also that Timaeus had obtained the highest posts of government. It represents to us the royal power of the demiurgus, and which has dominion over wholes, his scepter, according to theologists, consisting of 24 measures. But to add likewise that he had enjoyed the greatest honors, presents us with an image of that transcendency which is exempt from wholes, both in dignity and power. It is the demiurgus, therefore, who also distributes honors to others. 0 And it may be said that the assertion that Timaeus had arrived at the summit of philosophy assimilates him to the god, who at once perfectly contains all knowledge in himself, so that, from all that has been said, you may apprehend, as from images, who the demiurgus of the universe is, that he is an intellect comprehensive of many intellects, and a range among the intellectual gods, that he is full of the first intelligibles, and that he has a royal establishment, as surpassing in dignity the other demiurgic gods. If, however, Plato calls the city of Timaeus Locris, it not being usual with the Greeks thus to denominate it, but to call it Locri only, In order to distinguish it from the locus opposite to eubia, we must not wonder, for Plato changes many things for the purpose of signifying in a clearer manner the thing proposed. But that the Locrians were governed by the best laws is evident, for their legislator was Zaleucus. Besides, we all know that Critias is not ignorant of any of the particulars of which we are now speaking. Critias, indeed, was of a generous and grand nature. He likewise engaged in philosophic conferences, and was called, as history informs us, an idiot among philosophers, but a philosopher among idiots. He tyrannized also, being one of the 30. It is not, however, just to accuse Socrates on this account, because he now thinks him deserving of a certain praise. For, in the first place, we should attend to the manner in which he praises him, for he says, that he is not ignorant of any of the particulars of which we are now speaking, both on account of his natural disposition, and his association with philosophers. In the next place, we should observe, that the tyrannical character is an argument of an excellent nature, as we learn from the fable in the Republic, which particularly leads souls descending from the heavens to a tyrannical life, for being accustomed there to revolve with the gods, and to govern the universe in conjunction with them, in these terrestrial regions also, they pursue apparent power, just as those who possess the remembrance of intelligible beauty, embrace visible beauty. That Critias, however, pertains, according to analogy, to the middle fabrication of things, may be learnt, in the first place, from his succeeding to the discourse of Socrates, in the next place, from his narrating the Atlantic history, the Atlantics being the progeny of Neptune, and, in the third place, from his own proper life, for the ruling peculiarity, and that which extends to many things, are the characteristics of this life. Power, likewise pertains to media, and therefore he possesses the middle place in the encomiums, for to assert of him, that he was not one of the vulgar, but a partaker of the prerogatives of Timaeus, shows his inferiority to the first person of the dialogue, but that he was not entirely removed from him, indicates his alliance to him, nor is this to be doubted of Hermocrates, since a multitude of circumstances evince that he is, both by nature and education, adapted to all such concerns. Hermocrates was a Syracusan general, desirous of living conformably to law, hence also he participates, in a certain respect, of the political science and philosophy. He must be referred, therefore, according to analogy, to the third fabrication of things, for the command of an army is a power allied to the god, who arranges the last and most disorderly parts of mundane fabrication, and to be testified by a multitude of circumstances, indicates an analogy to the power that produces fabrication into all multitude, and an ultimate division. We therefore make this arrangement, in order that the men may have an analogy to the things. But others arrange Critias as inferior to Hermocrates, though the absent person was neither adapted to speak nor to hear, and of those that are present, at a conference, he who is an auditor, indeed, but is silent, is secondary to him who is both an auditor and a speaker, and in this respect imitates those that are about Socrates and Timaeus. In the next place, this also must be considered, that Socrates gives the preference to Critias, in what he says, praising him immediately after Timaeus. There are likewise those who attribute such an order as the following to these persons, viz. They arrange Timaeus according to the paradigmatic cause, Socrates according to the efficient, and Critias according to the formal cause, for he leads into energy those that have been rightly educated, but Hermocrates according to the material cause. Hence also he is adapted indeed to hear, but not to speak, for matter receives productive powers externally, but is not naturally adapted to generate, and this arrangement indeed will be found to be very reasonable, if we abandon the former conceptions, relative to the analogy of the men. Hence when you yesterday requested me to discuss what pertains to a polity, I readily complied with your request, being persuaded that the remainder of the discourse could not be more conveniently explained by any one than by you, if you were but willing to engage in its discussion. For when you have properly adapted the city for warlike purposes, there is no one in the present age but you from whom it can acquire everything fit for it to receive. As I have, therefore, hitherto complied with your request, I shall now require you to comply with mine in the above-mentioned particulars. Nor have you, indeed, refused this employment, but have, with common consent, determined to repay my hospitality with the banquet of discourse. I now, therefore, stand prepared, in a decorous manner, to receive the promised feast. The summary repetition of the polity appears, indeed, as Socrates now says, to have been made for the sake of the discussion of the contests in war of a rightly constituted city. Both a concise comprehension, however, of the polity, and the Atlantic War, refer us to the one fabrication of the world. For, as we have before observed, it is better, prior to the whole fabrication, and all the form of the production of the world, to make a survey from parts and images. Socrates, therefore, resuming the polity in certain forms, and, first, through this imitating the universe, very properly establishes himself, as it were, in essence, but excites others to the discussion, who celebrate the power of such a city, and imitate those who arrange the universe according to the middle demiurgic form, and uniformly comprehend the contrarieties and multiform motions which it contains. As, therefore, Jupiter, in Homer, being seated in his citadel on the summit of Olympus, and abiding in his accustomed unity, sends the gods who preside over the mundane contrariety to the Grecian war. 6. Thus also Socrates, being purely established in the intelligible form of a polity, prepares those after him that are able to celebrate the motion and power of this polity, calling forth, indeed, the science of Timaeus, to the survey of wholes totally, but preparing the others to the total and concise comprehension of partial natures. For as he had discussed the polity totally, after this manner also, he wishes that the power of it should be celebrated by the rest. Since, however, all these discourses bring with them an image of demiurgic works, and the whole conference adumbrates the fabrication of the world, Socrates very properly says, that he stands prepared, in a decorous manner, to receive the promised feast, his words being invested with modesty, as a form adapted to virtue. Hermocrates retorts, but we, O Socrates, as Timaeus just now signified, shall cheerfully engage in the execution of your desire, for we cannot offer any excuse sufficient to justify neglect in this affair. For yesterday, when we departed from hence, and went to the lodging of Critias, where we are accustomed to reside, both in his apartment and in the way thither, we discoursed on this very particular. It was requisite that Hermocrates should say something, and not be silently present, like the unemployed persons in a comedy. Hence also he is represented speaking to Socrates, and this indeed is logographic, or pertaining to the art of writing, but it is likewise adapted to what has been before said, for it represents to us, as in an image, that the last parts, of the fabrication of things, follow the one Father of wholes, and, through similitude to him, converge to the one providence of the world. For Hermocrates, following Socrates, says, that nothing shall be wanting, either of alacrity or power, to the accomplishment of the narrations investigated by Socrates, for these two things become especially impediments to us in our mutual energies, viz. Our indolence, and any external impediment. Removing, therefore, both these, he says, that there cannot be any excuse sufficient to justify their neglect, or prevent them from accomplishing the mandate of Socrates. Very properly, therefore, does he call upon Critias for the narration respecting the city of the ancient Athenians, in which the mandate of Socrates terminates, just as Socrates calls on Timaeus, and makes himself the partaker of his discourse. For on the preceding day, Hermocrates says, they discoursed on this very particularly together with Critias, just as the third demiurgus in the universe communicates with the production of the second. for the whole of generation is entirely in want of returns from the subterranean world. If, however, these things subsist after this manner, the Atlantic history will appear to have had the third narration. But those numbers, the duad and the triad, are said to be adapted to the middle fabrication, the former through power, and the latter through its demiurgic providence, and which is also perfective of mundane natures, so that whether you assign to this history a double or a triple narration you will, from either of the numbers, be able to recur to the conception of the intervening medium. He therefore narrated to us the following particulars from ancient rumor, which I wish, O Critias, you would now repeat to Socrates, that he may judge whether it any way conduces to the fulfillment of his request. Critias says, it is requisite to comply, if agreeable to Timaeus, the third associate of our undertaking. Lumanius answers, I assent to your compliance. You will find in these words an admirable indication, as in images, of divine natures. For, as in them, such as are secondary call forth the prolific powers of such as are primary, and produce them to the providential inspection of the subjects of their government. Thus also here Hermocrates calls on Critias to speak, and gives completion to what was promised to Socrates, and as, among divine natures, effects convert themselves to the reception of their causes, thus also here, Hermocrates is extended to Critias, but Critias looks to the mandate of Socrates, as likewise all demiurgic causes are suspended from the one Father of the universe, and govern all things conformably to his will. After the same manner here also all the persons fly to Timaeus, and to his nod, or consent, or will, in order that, being impelled from that as from a root, they may dispose their narration agreeably to his desire. For thus what is going to be said will contribute to the discourse about the whole fabrication of the world. Moreover, the words from ancient rumor, if the narration is historical, signify ancient according to time, but if they are an indication of what takes place in the universe, they will obscurely signify the reasons or productive powers which are from eternity inherent in souls, and if, likewise, they bring with them an image of divine causes, they show that these demiurgic causes, being supernally filled from more ancient gods, impart also to secondary natures their own providential energies. Critias states, here, then, O Socrates, a narration surprising indeed in the extreme, yet in every respect true, which was once delivered by Solon, the wisest of the 7 wise men, with respect to the whole of this narration about the Atlantics. Some say that it is a mere history, which was the opinion of Crantor, the first interpreter of Plato, who says that Plato was derided by those of his time, as not being the inventor of the Republic, but transcribing what the Egyptians had written on this subject, and that he so far regards what is said by these deriders as to refer to the Egyptians this history about the Athenians and Atlantics, and to believe that the Athenians once lived conformably to this polity. Crantor adds that this is testified by the prophets of the Egyptians, who assert that these particulars, which are narrated by Plato, are written on pillars which are still preserved. Others again say that this narration is a fable, and a fictitious account of things, which by no means had an existence, but which bring with them an indication of natures which are perpetual, or are generated in the world, not attending to Plato, who exclaims that the narration is surprising in the extreme, yet is in every respect true, for that which is in every respect true, is not partly true, and partly not true, nor is it false according to the apparent, but true according to the inward meaning, since a thing of this kind would not be perfectly true. Others do not deny that these transactions took place after this manner, but think that they are now assumed as images of the contrarieties that pre-exist in the universe. For war, say they, is the father of all things, as Heraclitus also asserted, and of these, some refer the analysis to the fixed stars and planets, so that they assume the Athenians as analogous to the fixed stars, but the Atlantics to the planets. They likewise say that these stars fight on account of the opposition in their circulation, but that the fixed stars vanquish the planets on account of the one convolution of the world. Of this opinion, therefore, is the illustrious Aemilius, who vehemently contends that this must be the case, because it is clearly said in the Critias, that the Atlantic island was divided into 7 circles, but I do not know of any other who is of the same opinion. Others, again, as Origen, refer the analysis to the opposition of certain demons, some of them being more, but others less, excellent, and some of them being superior in multitude, but others in power, some of them vanquishing, but others being vanquished, but others refer it to the discord of souls, the more excellent being the pupils of Minerva, but the inferior kind being subservient to generation, who also pertain to the god that presides over generation, that is to Neptune, and this is the interpretation of Numenius. Others, mingling, as they fancy, the opinions of Origen and Numenius together, say, that the narration refers to the opposition of souls to demons, the latter drawing down, but the former being drawn down, and with these men, demon has a triple subsistence, for they say, that one kind is that of divine demons, another, of demons according to habitude, to which partial souls give completion, when they obtain a demoniacal allotment, and another is that of depraved demons, who are also noxious to souls demons, therefore, of this last kind, wage this war against souls, in their descent into generation, and that, say they, which ancient theologists refer to Osiris and Typhon, or to Bacchus and the Titans, this, Plato, from motives of piety, refers to the Athenians and Atlantics. Before, however, souls descend into solid bodies, those theologists and Plato deliver the war of them with material demons who are adapted to the West, since the West, as the Egyptians say, is the place of the noxious demons. Of this opinion is the philosopher Porphyry, respecting whom, it would be wonderful, if he asserted anything different from the doctrine of Numenius. These philosophers, however, are in my opinion, very excellently corrected by the most divine Iamblichus, according to him, therefore, and also to our preceptor Syrianus. This contrariety and opposition are not introduced for the purpose of rejecting the narration, since on the contrary, this is to be admitted as an account of transactions that actually happened, but, as we are accustomed to do, we must refer that which precedes the subject of the dialogue, to the scope itself of the dialogue. Hence, they are of opinion, that this contrariety which is derived from human affairs, should, according to a similar form, be extended through the whole world, and especially through the realms of generation, that in consequence of this, we should survey everywhere how things participate of contrariety, according to the variety of powers, for since all things from the one, and from the duet after the one, are in a certain respect united to each other, and have an opposite nature, as in the genera of being, there is a certain opposition of sameness to difference, and of motion to permanency, but all things participate of these genera. This being the case, we must survey after what manner mundane natures possess the contrariety which pervades through all things. Moreover, if we consider the polity of Plato as analogous in every respect to the world, it is necessary that we should survey this war as existing in every nature, for the polity is analogous to existence and essences, but war, to the powers of these essences, and as Plato says, to their motions. We must, likewise, refer the polity, by making it common to all things, to the whole union of things, but it must be said, that war is to be assimilated to the mundane division, and to the empire of victory. Whether, therefore, you give a twofold division to the universe, by separating it into the incorporeal and the corporeal, and again divide the incorporeal into the more intellectual and the more material natures, and the corporeal into heaven and generation, and heaven, into contrary periods, but generation into opposite powers, or in whatever way you assume this opposite life, whether in the mundane gods, or in demons, in souls, or in bodies, you may everywhere transfer the analogies from men to things. For of the gods themselves, the divine Homer makes oppositions, representing Apollo as hostilely opposed to Neptune, Mars to Minerva, the river Xanthus to Vulcan, Hermes to Latona, and Juno to Diana. For it is requisite to survey generation in incorporeal natures, in bodies, and in both. It is likewise necessary to consider Neptune and Apollo as the fabricators of the whole of generation, the one totally, but the other partially, but Juno and Diana, as the suppliers of vivification, the former rationally, but the latter physically, Minerva and Mars, as the causes of the contrariety which pervades through both existence and life, the former, of that which is defined according to intellect, but the latter, of that which is more material and passive, Hermes and Latona, as presiding over the twofold perfection of souls, the former indeed, over the perfection which is obtained through the Gnostic powers, and the evolution into light of productive principles, but the latter, over the smooth, spontaneous, and voluntary elevation which is acquired through the vital powers, Vulcan and Xanthus, as the primary leaders of the whole of a corporeal constitution, and of the powers which it contains, the former, of those that are more efficacious, but the latter of those that are more passive, and as it were more material. But he leaves Venus by herself, in order that she may illuminate all things with union and harmony, and represents her as fighting on the war side, because the one in those that belong to this side, is less excellent than multitude. For all contrariety is surveyed in a becoming manner in conjunction with a unity, which is either prior to it, or connoissant with, or is in a certain respect and adjunct posterior to it. And Plato, as well as theologists, rightly perceiving that this is the case, have delivered a multitudinous contrariety prior to the one fabrication of the world, and parts prior to wholes, finding, likewise, these things in images prior to paradigms. He surveys this contrariety in men, which also has an analogous subsistence in wholes, neither being in want of titanic or gigantic wars, for how could he narrate such wars to Socrates, who on the preceding day had blamed the poets for devising things of this kind, receiving, therefore, transactions from history, in order that he might not assert of the gods that they fight with each other. He ascribes these battles to men, but through a cautious and pious analogy, transfers them also to the gods. For such like wars are delivered by divinely inspired poets, prior to the one order of things. Their mode, however, of narrating them, is adapted to them, but the present mode to Plato, the latter, in conjunction with the political science, being more moderate, but the former, in conjunction with the delistic art, being more replete with divine inspiration, and thus much concerning the whole of the text, in what is said by Critias. However, the word here is proverbial, and is employed in those things to which we wish to call the attention of the hearer. The word here, therefore, is equivalent to receive what is worthy of attention, but the word surprising manifests that which happens contrary to expectation, as in the Gorgias, it is surprising, O Socrates, or that which is paradoxical, as in the Crito, what a surprising dream, Socrates, or the wonderful, as in the Theaetetus, and it is not at all surprising, but it would be much more wonderful, if it were not a thing of this kind, but here it is assumed as that which deserves admiration. This, however, is evident from what follows, in which it is said, that the deeds of this city were great and admirable. Moreover, the word narration, logos, manifests the truth of what is going to be related. For thus it is said in the Gorgias, that a fable differs from logos, because the latter is true, but the former is not. It is also very properly said, that Solon was the wisest of the 7 wise men, as being asserted of one who was related to Plato, as being said to another Athenian, and in the Panathenae, and as indicating that the ensuing narration extends to all wisdom. Nor is it requisite to wonder how Solon is said to be the wisest of all the 7 wise men, nor to be anxious to know how he can be said to be the wisest of other men, but one of the wise men, when all of them were most wise. For what absurdity is there, in calling a man the wisest of those that are of the same order with himself. But his legislation, his pretended insanity at Salamis, his armed attack of Pisistratus the tyrant, who said he was more prudent than those that were absent, and more brave than those that were present, his conference also with Croesus, and his answer to one who said that he had established most beautiful laws, for he replied that he had not established the most beautiful, but powerful laws, and that he knew laws that were more excellent than these. All these particulars bear testimony to his wisdom. There is, likewise, a story told of a tripod that was dragged up in a net by certain young men, though it is not related by all historians, and that the oracle of Apollo, being consulted on the occasion, the god answered that it should be given to the wisest man, that in consequence of this, it was offered to Thales, but he sent it to another of the 7 wise men, this again to another, and so on, till at last it came to Solon, all of them yielding it to him. Solon, however, sent it to the god, saying that he was the wisest of beings. Solon, also, is said to have found that the lunar month does not consist of 30 days, and on this account he was the first that called it
Neon.
a new one, and
Neas.
new, and, in short, the discovery that the numbers of the days revert from the 20th day is ascribed to him. Some, also, assert that prior to Anaxagoras, Solon showed that intellect presided over the whole of things, from all which it is evident that he was a participant of a certain wisdom. Solon, then, was the familiar and intimate friend of our great-grandfather, Dropides, as he himself frequently relates in his poems, but he once declared to our grandfather Critias, as the old man himself informed us, that great and admirable actions had once been achieved by this city, which nevertheless were buried in oblivion through length of time, and the destruction of mankind. The history of the race of Solon, and of the alliance of Plato to him, is as follows. The children of Exocestides were Solon and Dropides, and of Dropides Critias was the son, who is mentioned by Solon in his poems, where he sings, "Bid Critias with the yellow locks, attention to his father pay, for by revering what he says, no faulty leader he'll obey." But Calliscus and Glauco were the sons of Critias, and again the Critias of the present dialogue was the son of Calliscus. This, however, is evident from Critias in the Charmids, calling the father of Charmids his uncle, but Charmids and Paraxener were the offspring of Glauco, and Paraxener was the mother of Plato, so that Glauco was the uncle of Critias, but the father of Charmids, and Charmides was the uncle of Plato, but Solon was the brother of the great-grandfather of Critias. Such, therefore, is the truth respecting the race of Solon. The divine Iamblichus, however, gives a different account of the succession of his race, for he immediately makes Glauco to be the son of Dropides. But others, as the Platonic Theon, assert that Critias and Glauco were the sons of Calliscus, though in the Charmids, Critias says that Charmides is the son of Glauco or uncle, but is my cousin. Hence Glauco is not the son of Dropides, nor the brother of the younger Critias. To a man, however, who pays attention to things, it is of no consequence in whatever manner these particulars may subsist. Passing on, therefore, to things, you may assume from these particulars as images, that all the discord of the world, and the twofold coordinations that are in it, are suspended from proximate demiurgic causes, and are referred to other more intellectual and ancient causes, that the causes of this motion are continuous and united, and suspended from one cause, that the superior causes are more ancient in intellection, and that secondary receive the production of primary natures, differ from and yet have a connascent communion with them. In addition to these things also, you may assume that a twofold oblivion is produced in souls of the theory of great and admirable wholes, arising either from having abandoned for a long time a life of that kind, or through having fallen immoderately into generation. For this is for the real man to be truly corrupted, one but souls that have been recently perfected, and retain the memory of things in the intelligible world, in consequence of not falling into matter, easily acquire a reminiscence of the truth, and thus much for these particulars. We must not, however, wonder if Critias calls Solon a familiar, for we not only call those with whom we associate, but also our kindred, familiars, but by likewise adding, and an intimate friend, he indicates that there was not merely a communion of race, but a sameness and similitude of life, in the ancestors of Plato. The prior Critias, also, is called an old man, which signifies his possession of prudence and intellect, and is being adapted to many disciplines. In particular, he informed me of one undertaking surpassing in magnitude all the rest, which I now think proper to relate to you, both, that I may repay my obligations, and that by such a relation I may offer my tribute of praise to the goddess in the present solemnity, by celebrating her divinity, as it were, with hymns, justly, and in a manner agreeable to truth. Longinus doubts what was the intention of Plato in the insertion of this narration, for he does not introduce it either for the purpose of giving respite to the auditors, or as being in want of it, and he dissolves the doubt, as he thinks, by saying that it is assumed by Plato prior to physiology, in order to allure the reader, and soften the severity of that kind of writing. But Origen says that the narration is indeed a fiction, and so far he agrees with Numenius and his followers, but he does not admit with Longinus that it was devised for the sake of pleasure. He does not, however, add the cause of the fiction. We, therefore, have frequently said that it contributes to the whole theory of nature, and we likewise say that in these words, Plato calls the one and common productive principle of the twofold coordinations in the world, and the one contrariety which pervades through wholes, the greatest and most admirable of works, as containing the other fabrication of things in infrangible bonds, this fabrication consisting of participations of the contraries, bound and infinity, as Philolaus says, and as Plato also asserts in the Philebus, for he there says that there is much bound and much infinity in the world, which are things most contrary to each other, and give completion to this universe, since, however, all things that contribute to the production of the world are said to recompense the benefits bestowed by total causes. Critias says very properly that it becomes a time to repay his obligations to Socrates, who excited both the second and third powers. These things, therefore, may be immediately assumed from the words before us. But will you not say that the Minerval solemnity has an indication of demiurgic works, for the goddess herself indeed connectedly contains all the mundane fabrication, and possesses intellectual lives in herself, according to which she weaves together the universe, and unifying powers, according to which she governs all the mundane oppositions. The Minerval solemnity, however, indicates the gift of the goddess which pervades through all things, and fills all things herself, and likewise the union which extends through all variety, for in solemnities, we especially embrace a common and concordant life. If, however, we have asserted these things rightly, we may from these transfer ourselves to the various and one life of the world, and survey the difference between the Parmenides and this dialogue, for both have their hypothesis in the Panathenaea, but the former in the greater, and the latter in the lesser of these solemnities, for they were celebrated about the same time with the Bendidian festival, and this very properly. For since the productions of Minerva are twofold, total and partial, supermundane and mundane, intelligible and sensible, the former of these solemnities, indeed, pertains to the exempt productions of the goddess, unfolding into light the intelligible series of the gods, but the latter to her subordinate productions, interpreting the powers of the gods about the world, and the Bendidian festival, indeed, appears to manifest the suppression of the contrariety externally exceeding to the universe from a barbaric tempest, by the gods who are the inspective guardians of the festival. Hence it is said to have been celebrated in the Piraeus, as being adapted to the extremities, and material parts of the universe, but the Panathenaian festival exhibits the established order which proceeds into the world from intellect, and the unconfused separation of mundane contrarieties, for this goddess is at one and the same time, a lover of wisdom, and a lover of war. Another veil, therefore, was referred to the goddess, in the Bendidian festival, representing the war in which the pupils of Minerva were victorious, just as the veil in the Panathenaian solemnity represented the giants vanquished by the Olympian gods. The goddess, however, is celebrated with hymns, justly and with truth, justly, indeed, because it is necessary that everything which has proceeded should be converted to its proper principle, but with truth, because the hymn is assumed through things and through beings, and because of hymns, some celebrate the essence, but others the providence of the gods, and others praise the works that proceed from them, and a hymn of this kind is the last form of celebration, for the praise of the divine essence precedes all other panegyrics, as Socrates asserts in the Banquet. This being the case, the words celebrating as it were, are very properly added, for he wishes to celebrate the goddess from the deeds performed by the Athenians, but that the Panathenaian followed the Bendidian festivals, is asserted both by the commentators, and by Aristotle the Rhodian, for they say that the Bendidia were celebrated in the Piraeus on the 20th day of April, but that the festival sacred to Minerva followed these. Socrates says, "You speak well, but what is this ancient achievement, which Critias once heard from Solon, and which is not narrated in history, but was once actually accomplished by this city?" Socrates, exciting Critias to narration, requests that he would relate the mighty undertaking which the ancient Critias said he had heard from Solon, and which, though not much celebrated, yet was really performed, in which, this in the first place deserves to be considered, that many things happen in the universe of which the multitude are ignorant, and in this, worthy men differ from others, that they see things of this kind, and understand the events that take place. But it is worthwhile secondly to observe, that the more perfect causes rejoice in simplicity, and proceed from things of a composite nature, to such as are first, but subordinate beings on the contrary, descend from things simple to things composite. For thus also here Socrates recurs from that which is downward as far as to Solon, in an ascending progression, but Critias on the contrary, descends from Solon to the mention of himself. Critias offers, "I will acquaint you with that ancient history, which I did not, indeed, receive from a youth, but from a man very much advanced in years." Longinus here again observes, that Plato pays attention to elegance of diction, by narrating the same things differently, for he calls the undertaking
Archeon.
but the narration
Palaios.
and the man, not a youth, though as he signifies the same thing through all these, he might have denominated all of them after the same manner. Longinus, therefore, as Plotinus said of him, was a philologist, but not a philosopher. Origen, however, does not admit that Plato is studious of artificial delight and certain ornaments of diction, but that he pays attention to spontaneous and unadorned credibility, and accuracy in imitations. This mode also of expression has spontaneity, as being adapted to erudition, for it was rightly said by Aristoxenus, a lyric poet, that the dispositions of philosophers extend as far as to sounds, and exhibit in all things the arrangement which they possess, just, I think, as this mighty heaven exhibits in its transfigurations clear images of the splendor of intellectual perceptions, being moved in conjunction with the unapparent periods of intellectual natures. The great Iamblichus, however, thinks that we should rather refer the variety of the words to things, and see how in nature contraries are vanquished by the one, how the one is varied, and how great a mutation the same productive principles exhibit, subsisting in one way in the intellect of the universe, in another, in soul, in another, in nature, and in the last place, subsisting in matter, and again, unfolding about matter a most abundant difference in conjunction with similitude. For these observations are worthy the conceptions of Plato, and not a solicitous attention to diction, for at that time Critias, as he himself declared, was almost 90 years old, and I was about 10. These three persons are assumed as having preserved this history, or mythology: Solon, the ancient Critias, and this junior Critias, because perfect causes precede the fabrication of the world, and perfective causes are antecedent to the subjects of their government. The elder Critias, however, heard this narration from Solon, one. From the elder Critias, it was heard by the junior Critias and Amminander, and from the junior Critias 3 persons received it. For the monad proceeds through the duad to the perfective providence of wholes. The numbers also of the ages have much alliance to the things themselves, for the decade manifests the conversion of all mundane natures to the one, and 90 the restitution again to the monad, in conjunction with progression. But both numbers are symbolical of the world. You may say, therefore, that Solon is analogous to the cause of permanency, but the former Critias, to the cause which supplies progression, and the present Critias to the cause which converts and conjoins things which have preceded to their causes. And the first of these, indeed, preserves the relation of a ruling and leading cause, the second, of the cause which comes into contact with mundane fabrication in a liberated manner, and the third, of that which now pays attention to the universe, and governs the mundane war. When, therefore, that solemnity was celebrated among us, which is known by the name of Curotis Apoturium, nothing was omitted, which boys during that festivity are accustomed to perform. For when our parents had set before us the rewards proposed for the contest of singing verses, both a multitude of verses of many poets were recited, and many of us especially sung the poems of Solon, because they were, at that time, entirely new. The Apoturia was a festival sacred to Bacchus, on account of the duel between Melanthus and Xanthus the Boeotian, and the victory of Melanthus through deception. The Boeotians and Athenians waging war with each other for Ono. But this festival was celebrated for 3 days, of which the first day was called
Αναρρήσεις.
because many sacrifices were performed in it, and the victims were called
Αναρρήματα.
because they were drawn upward, and sacrificed. The second day was called
Δόρπια.
for on this day there were splendid banquets and much feasting. But the third day was called
Πουρεωτής.
for on this day boys, 3 or 4 years old, were enrolled in their tribes. On this day also, such boys as were more sagacious than the rest, sung certain poems, and those were victorious who retained the greater number of them in their memory. They sang, however, the poems of the ancients. But with respect to the tribes, it must be observed, that after Ion there were 4 families, but from Clisthenes 10, and that after these, each 12 of the families was divided into 3. The tribes were arranged into the same family and company, as being allied to each other. The enrollment of the boys was into these tribes, and this day, as we have before observed, was called Curotis, from the boys that were enrolled. And such is the information derived from history. Again, however, let us direct our attention to things, and behold these, in the particulars that have been narrated, as in images. The festival, therefore, of the Apoturia, which had for its pretext the victory of the Athenians, pertains to the hypothesis according to which the Athenians conquered the Atlantics, and all intellectual subdue material natures. Deception, likewise, is adapted to mundane forms, which separate themselves from impartible and immaterial principles, and become apparent, instead of truly existing beings. But the enrollment of the boys imitates the arrangements of partial souls into their proper allotments, and their descents into different generations. The festival is an imitation of the eternal hilarity in the world, for if it is filled with gods, it celebrates a perpetual festival. But the contests of rhapsody are analogous to the contests which souls sustain, weaving their own life together with the universe, and the rhapsody itself resembles the above-mentioned woven life of the universe. For this has an imitation of intellectual forms, in the same manner as the contests of rhapsody have of heroic actions and manners, possessing together with an harmonious conjunction, a connected series, the many poems of many poets, adumbrate the many natures, and many circummundane productive powers, and, in short, the division of physical imitations. But the new poems are images of forms which are perpetually flourishing, always perfect and prolific, and able to operate efficaciously on other things, and thus much concerning these particulars. Mention, however, is made of the poems of Solon, not as of a poet in the popular sense of the word, but as of one who mingled philosophy with poetry. For of mundane works likewise, and whole productions, a royal intellect is the leader, and the praise is related as being mentioned to another person, that is to Amenander, because, as we learn in the Phaedrus, that which judges differs from that which makes and generates. Referring, however, all that has been said, to the universe, we may infer as from images, that partial souls, partial natures, and partible forms, and of these, those especially that are always new and efficacious, contribute to the mundane war. But all these are connected together by the gods, who are the inspective guardians of fabrication, and are co-arranged with one world, one harmony, and one kindred life. But then one of our tribe, whether he was willing to gratify Critias, or whether it was his real opinion, affirmed that Solon appeared to him to be most wise in other concerns, and in things respecting poetry, the most ingenuous and free of all poets. Upon hearing this, the old man, for I very well remember, was vehemently delighted, and said, laughing, if Solon, O Amenander, had not engaged in poetry as a casual affair, but had made it as others do a serious employment, and if through seditions and other fluctuations of the state in which he found his country involved, he had not been compelled to neglect the completion of the history which he brought from Egypt, I do not think that either Hesiod or Homer, or any other poet, would have acquired greater glory and renown. Here again, the lovers of diction may indicate to their admirers that Plato cautiously praises the poetry of Solon, since he represents the praise as bestowed by a private individual, and for the sake of others, and not as given by one who spoke conformably to intellect and reason. For Plato, if any one, was a most excellent judge of poets, as Longinus also admits. Heraclides Ponticus therefore says, that Chorilus and Antimachus being at that time most renowned, Plato preferred the poems of the latter to those of the former, and that he persuaded Heraclides at Colophon to collect the poems of Antimachus. In vain, therefore, is it futilely observed by Callimachus and Eurus, that Plato was not a sufficient judge of poets. Hence, what is here said manifests the judgment of the philosopher, and it may be considered in a more historical point of view. The investigator, however, of things, will think it requisite to show how all the causes of the orderly distribution of the universe, and also the causes that are connective of contrariety, are extended to one principle, and how the last adhere through media to the first of things. For thus those who receive the narration of the ancient Critias are extended to him, but he looks to Solon, and he, indeed, admires the poetic power of Solon, but they, through Critias as a medium, are referred to the poetry of Solon. For gratifying the former, that is Critias, they praise the poetry of the latter. But what is it that Critias says respecting Solon? That he was subordinate to divinely inspired poets, from these two causes, because he engaged in poetry as a casual affair, and because when he came from Egypt, he found the city of the Athenians in a state of sedition, and that he was not able, his country being involved in difficulties, to complete the history, which he brought from thence hither. What the history therefore was, he informs us as he proceeds. From these things, however, as images, Plato manifests that what is primarily demiurgic, and everything effective, have other primary energies, but that their secondary energy is the production of secondary things. Likewise, that the confused, disorderly, and unstable nature of matter frequently does not receive ornament from more divine causes, but subsists without symmetry to the gift which proceeds from them. Hence, second and third powers are unfolded into light, which proximately adorn its formless nature. Solon, therefore, being most ingenuous, and imitating exempt causes, did not deliver through poetry the Atlantic war, but Critias, and those posterior to him, transmit the account of this war to others, imitating second and third causes, who produce the variety of effective principles, and the orderly distribution of things, which is harmonized from contraries into a visible subsistence. Moreover, the assertion that Solon was the wisest of the 7 wise men, exhibits his analogy to the first principles, and this being most free, adumbrates the power which is exempt, and established in itself, and which fills all things in a liberated manner. A thing of this kind likewise concurs with the wise man, as being immaterial, without a master, and of itself. The ancient Critias, also, being said to be old, indicates a cause which is intellectual, and remote from generation. For wisdom, says Plato, and true opinions are most desirable things to him who has arrived at old age. Again, the assertion of Critias, that he very well remembers, exhibits to our view the salvation of eternal productive powers, and the stable energy of secondary causes, about such as in first. But Solon engaging in poetry as a casual affair, represents to us that productions into secondary natures have only a secondary rank among first causes, for their first energies are intellectual, according to which they are united to the beings prior to themselves. If, however, someone omitting the survey of things, should consider through what cause Plato introduced these particulars, according to their apparent meaning, he will very properly find that they contributed to the thing proposed. For the design of Plato was to narrate the Atlantic war, but it was requisite that the messenger of this history should neither deceive nor be deceived. Hence also, Solon is said to have been most wise, and intimately acquainted with those about Critias, for as a wise man, he was not deceived, and as being an intimate acquaintance, he would not deceive. It was likewise requisite, that the receiver of this history should neither have been aged, in order that the narration may appear to be ancient, nor yet so young, as to be forgetful. Hence, Critias is supposed to have been a youth, but sufficiently able to remember, and in consequence of this, to have contended with others in rhapsody, in which much memory is necessary. Farther still, it was requisite that the ancient Critias should not commit such like narrations to very young men, lest they should appear to them to be contemptible. Hence, it is very properly said, that some one of the tribes, by inquiry of Solon, heard the history, but it was requisite that he also should, in a certain respect, have been familiar with Solon, in order that the old man might opportunely relate all the history to him. Hence, likewise, the praises of the poetry of Solon precede the history, the praise being given by Aminander in order to gratify Critias, and thus much concerning the disposition of what is said in the text, that Solon, however, went to Egypt, not only for the purpose of obtaining the Atlantic history, but likewise that the Athenians, during his absence, obeyed his laws, which he had bound them by an oath not to violate, is evident, for during this time, also, he associated with Croesus, and sailed to Egypt, but on his return, he became master of the city, which was in a tumultuous condition through the Pisistratii, and thus much we have derived from history. Origen, however, doubts how Plato calls Solon most free, for this is not an encomium adapted to a poet, and he dissolves the doubt by saying, that he is so called, either because he spent his money liberally, or because he used the greatest freedom of speech, and that on this account he was free, without any timidity in his poetical compositions, or he was so denominated, as being in his poetry remiss and uncompelled. But Iamblichus says, that no one of these solutions is true, but that through this appellation, the liberated condition of the intellect of Solon, the unservile nature of his virtue, and that which was venerable in his character, and which transcended all other things, are signified. The same interpreter also says that the laughter of Critias manifests a generative progression from causes, perfect, and rejoicing in its progeny, but the remembering well indicates the salvation of effective principles in the world. Why, therefore, was Solon anxious to deliver the Atlantic War in verse? Because, says he, all natural works and the mundane contrarieties subsist through imitation, for this is analogous to its effective and primary causes, just as Critias is analogous to proximate and secondary causes. But why was he prevented by sedition? Because material motions and material tumult become an impediment, as we have before observed, to the productive powers of mundane causes. In consequence of this, Amminander inquired of Critias what that history was, to which he answered, that it was concerning an affair, which ought most justly to be the greatest and most renowned which this city ever accomplished, though through length of time, and the destruction of those by whom it was undertaken, the fame of its execution has not reached the present age. Longinus says, that something is wanting here to render the sense complete, for the word considered is wanting to the words most justly to be, because these are required in what follows, but not the one.
Osis.
Being. Porphyry, however, says, that Longinus did not perceive, that, in consequence of the undertaking being the greatest, but not yet celebrated, Plato adds, or most justly to be most renowned, but we, directing our attention to things, say, that Plato calls it the greatest undertaking, as bringing with it an image of all contrariety, extending itself everywhere, and that he denominates it most renowned, as contributing to the visible fabrication of things. For thus, also, the works of nature are called by Orpheus renowned, boundless eternity, and nature's works, renowned, remain. Relate this affair, O Critias, says Amminander, from the beginning, and inform us what that transaction was, how it was accomplished, and from whom Solon having heard it, narrated it as a fact, that is, relate what this admirable deed was, how, or after what manner it was performed, how it became known to, and by whom being preserved, it reached the hearing of Solon. Plato appears, through this, to investigate the whole form of contrariety, how it was affected, or may be known, and from what causes, to us invisible, it is suspended. Before, therefore, he recurred through relative to the narration of Solon, but now he investigates the superior histories of it, or, that I may speak clearer, the principles of the fabrication of this contrariety, and by directing your attention to this narration, you may survey, as in images, through certain symbols, all the principles of this fabrication, as far as to the first causes of it. There is, then, says he, a certain region of Egypt, called Delta, about the summit of which the streams of the Nile are divided, and in which there is a province called Zadical. In the first place, it is worthwhile to observe how the narration always delivers things comprehended, proceeding from such as are more comprehensive, from Egypt, indeed, the river, from this delta, from this the Sadic province, and from this Sais, sacred to Minerva. In the next place, having observed this, it will be proper to ascend through the analogy of these things, to the first and most comprehensive causes of fabrication, for you may perceive this supernally comprehended by more total causes, and proceeding as far as to the last of things, comprehending causes everywhere preceding such as are comprehended, the more total, such as are more partial, and the impartible fabrication, that which is partible, and is denominated recent, to which also the present words refer the father of the narration, and this fabrication, indeed, is filled from these causes, and particularly participates of the undefiled power of Minerva. For, in short, since we refer this war, for the sake of which the whole narration is excited, to the mundane contrariety, it will be well, proceeding in the same way, to assimilate all the knowledge of the Egyptian priests to the former, or impartible fabrication, which stably comprehends the productive powers contained in the universe, but the history of Solon, which is always recent, and placed in mutations, to the more novel fabrication, and which administers the all various circulations of mundane natures, we shall also be benefited by perceiving how, in images, the difference between human and divine fabrications becomes apparent, and how, in these, Solon, indeed, calls on the priest to the development of ancient transactions, but the priest knows both such events as are reckoned ancient by the Greeks, and prior to these, such as are truly ancient. For thus also, in divine fabrications, that which is recent or junior, is converted to that which is more ancient, and is perfected by it, but the latter antecedently comprehends the causes of the former, and is established above it, by still greater and more perfect intellectual perceptions and powers, and thus much concerning the whole of the text, it is necessary, however, to discuss every particular. With respect to Egypt, therefore, some call it an image of matter, others of the whole earth, as being divided analogously to it, and others of the intelligible, and the intelligible essence. But we say, that in what is here asserted, it is assimilated to the whole invisible order, which is the principle of visible natures. With respect to Delta also, it is produced from the Nile, being divided about the Saitic province, so as to make its egress from one right line to the right and left, and to the sea forming the hypotenuse of the triangle, which Plato calls the Saitic province, indicating, in what he here says, that it is that about which the stream of the Nile is divided. It is, however, analogous to the one vivific fountain of all divine life, and, in visible natures, to the celestial triangle which is connective of all generation, being proximate to the ram, which the Egyptians particularly honor, on account of Ammon having the face of a ram, and also because the ram is the principle of generation, and is moved with the greatest celerity, as being among the constellations be established about the equinoctial. The mention, therefore, of Delta is here very appropriate, since the triangle, as we shall learn in what follows, is the principle of the hypostasis of the mundane elements. But the Nile is to be arranged analogous to the zodiac, as being situated under it, having an inclination similar to it, and imitating, through its divisions, the obliquity of it, and its division about the equinoctial points. The Nile also is a symbol of the life which is poured on the whole world. Moreover, the two sides of the Nile, which run into the sea from the summit, of Delta, may be, in a certain respect, assimilated to the two coordinations, which proceed from one root as far as to generation, and of which generation is the recipient, so that a triangle is produced from them and their common receptacle, into which they can jointly flow. But the Saitic province, which forms a great part of Delta, participates also of a great portion of the celestial regions. Sais, therefore, must be sacerdotally referred to the constellation called the Bear, not because it is situated under it, nor on account of its coldness, but as participating of a certain peculiar efflux of the god, who preside over that constellation. Hence likewise Sais is not shaken by earthquakes, in consequence of receiving a firm establishment on account of the place about the pole of this province. The greatest city is Sais, from which also King Amasis derived his origin. The city has a presiding divinity, whose name is, in the Egyptian tongue, Neith, but in the Greek Athena, or Minerva. The inhabitants of this city were very friendly to the Athenians, to whom also they said they were after a certain manner allied. The word
Nomos,
or province, derived its appellation from the distribution of land, for thus the Egyptians called divisions of the great parts of Egypt, but from the city the whole province was denominated Saitic, just as Sebennytic is denominated from Sebennytus, and Canobic from Canobus. Amasis, however, is now assumed analogous to Solon, for he paid attention to wisdom and justice beyond all the other Egyptian kings. He is therefore conjoined with Solon, and has the same relation to him, which the city has to Athens, in order that we may survey the cities and the men adorned by the goddess, Minerva, as from one monad. and secondary natures always perfected from such as are more perfect. Callisthenes, however, and Phaenotimus relate that the Athenians were the fathers of Sati, but Theopompus, on the contrary, says that they were a colony of them. The Platonic Atticus says that Theopompus altered the history through envy, for, according to him, some of the inhabitants of Sais came to renew their alliance with the Athenians, but Plato only says thus much concerning them, that the Sati were very friendly to the Athenians, and after a certain manner allied to them. It is possible, however, that he might say this on account of the tutelar goddess of the city being the same with the Minerva of the Athenians. With respect, however, to this goddess, the guardian of the two cities, it is requisite to know that proceeding from intelligible and intellectual causes through the supercelestial orders, to certain parts of the celestial regions and terrene distributions, she is allotted places adapted to herself, not imparting an adventitious government of herself, but antecedently comprehending the essence and form of it, and thus possessing this allotment in a manner adapted to herself, that the government, however, of this goddess extends supernally as far as to the last of things. The Greeks manifest by asserting that she was generated from the head of Jupiter, but the Egyptians relate that in the adytum of the goddess there was this inscription: I am the things that are, that will be, and that have been. No one has ever laid open the garment by which I am concealed. The fruit which I brought forth was the sun. The goddess, therefore, being demiurgic, and at the same time apparent and unapparent, has an allotment in the heavens, and illuminates generation with forms. For of the signs of the zodiac, the ram is ascribed to the goddess, and the equinoctial circle itself, where especially a power motive of the universe is established, she is very properly, therefore, called by Plato a lover of wisdom, and a lover of war, and he now denominates her the leader of these allotments in the earth. In the first place, likewise, he honors the goddess in the language of his country, for the Athenians denominate the tutelar goddess of the city Archigetes, or the leader, celebrating her surname, and her presiding power. In the next place, he indicates the uniform pre-established comprehension in herself, of the allotments which are governed by her, and besides this he clearly represents to us, that it is possible for the same things to be signified through many words, since words are images of the things signified by them, for many statues may be formed of one thing from different materials, so that the Egyptians preserve the analogous, because they call the goddess by a name which has the same signification with that of the Greeks. Nor is it at all wonderful that both should denominate her rightly, in consequence of establishing the name according to one science. If, therefore, there is one tutelar goddess of the two cities Sais and Athens, the inhabitants of Sais are very properly said to be lovers of the Athenians, as being in a certain respect allied to them, for the affinity is not wholly perfect, for some may participate more and others less of the same providence, and some may participate of one, but others of another power contained in the goddess. For again, it is likewise necessary to know this, that a variation is produced in different nations from the places which they severally inhabit, from the temperature of the air, from habitude to the heavens, and still more partially from spermatic productive powers. But you may say that they especially differ according to the gregal government of the gods, and the diversities of the tutelar powers, from which you will find a difference in color, figure, voice, and motion, in different places, so that those who migrate into other countries frequently change, by dwelling in those countries, their color and voice, just as plants are changed together with the quality of the region, when they are transplanted in a foreign land. In this country Solon, on his arrival thither, was, as he himself relates, very honorably received, and on his inquiring about ancient affairs of those priests who possessed a knowledge of such particulars superior to others, he perceived that neither himself, nor any one of the Greeks, as he himself declared, had any knowledge of things of this kind. Solon, on account of his political wisdom, and on account of the dignity and worth of his city, justly appeared to be deserving of honor to the priests of Sais. but he found, with respect to memory and history, among the Greeks, that neither himself, nor any other Grecian, had any knowledge of very ancient transactions. The remembrance, however, of such transactions, contributes indeed to political virtue, and also contributes to the theory of the mundane periods, which Solon being desirous to know, and interrogating for this purpose the priests, found that he was perfectly deficient in knowledge of this kind. These things, likewise, are symbols of divine concerns, for a certain fabrication or workmanship is called by theologists recent, but this is particularly honored, as being suspended, from the Father of wholes, and from the intelligible gods, with whom there are intellectual perceptions exempt from other things, and which have more eternal natures for their objects. But those intellectual perceptions are more partial and less excellent, which are in secondary natures, and farther still, there is such a difference in demiurgic principles, that some of them are comprehensive of more total, but others of more partial forms, and some of them precede in dignity and power, but others are recent as with reference to them, and possess a subordinate power. Hence, when he once desired to excite them to the relation of pristine transactions, he for this purpose began to discourse about those most ancient events which formerly happened among us. I mean the traditions concerning the first Pharaonius and Niobe, and after the deluge, of Deucalion and Pyrrha, as described by the mythologists, together with their posterity, at the same time paying a proper attention to the different ages in which these events are said to have taken place, of such a nature as this are all divine causes, for they call forth more divine powers, and through this evocation, are filled from them with more divine and total intellections, such as is now effected by Solon. For extending to the Egyptian priests the most ancient transactions of the Greeks, he in a certain respect leads them to the narration of their antiquities, of which the Egyptians participate in a remarkable degree, as they survey without impediment the celestial bodies, through the purity of the air, and preserve ancient memorials, in consequence of not being destroyed either by water or fire. But the Assyrians, says Iamblichus, have not only preserved the memorials of 27 myriads of years, as Hipparchus says they have, but likewise of the apocatastases and periods of the 7 rulers of the world, so that this being admitted, there is still less reason to compare with these memorials the much celebrated archaeology of the Greeks, from which likewise it is evident, that the present narration does not look to that which is small, but to the whole and the universe. Farther still, the archaeology of the Greeks is different with different Grecian cities, for with the Athenians it proceeds as far as to Eratosthenes, who was a native of Athens, but with the Argives, as far as to Pharaonius and Niobe, for these two are with the Greeks the most ancient, for Argos descended from Niobe, but from Himaeus and Pelasgus, from whom Argos was denominated Pelasgic. The particulars, however, respecting Deucalion and Pyrrha, that a deluge taking place, they were preserved in Parnassus, and how migrating from thence, they restored the human race, are manifest, and also that antiquity with the Thessalians is as far as to these, but according to some, the Argolic race begins from Inatus, but that of the Athenians from Cecrops, each of whom was prior to Deucalion. Solon, therefore, relating these and such like particulars, causes the Egyptian priests to narrate their antiquities. We shall however see what one of the ancient priests said respecting the narration of Solon, and these things, indeed, will be evident through what follows. Solon, however, met at Sais with a priest called Patanete, but at Heliopolis, with a priest called Oclope, and at Sebenidus, with one whose name was Ethiman, as we learn from the histories of the Egyptians, and perhaps it was the priest of Sais, who says as follows to Solon. But upon this, one of those more ancient priests exclaimed, O Solon, Solon, you Greeks are always children, nor is there an aged Greek among you. The Egyptian priest is ancient, in order that while he reproves he may not be intolerable, and may have a probable reason for teaching about archaeology, but he employs a repetition of the name Solon, not only as striving beyond measure in what he is about to say, but also for the purpose of indicating the circulation of things from the same to the same, which the more total causes of things generated in the universe comprehend stably and intellectually, through indelible knowledge, to which causes the priest is analogous. He accuses, however, the Greeks as being always children, because they have not acquired the all-various wisdom of the Egyptians, but bear servile hairs in their soul. Juvenility, therefore, indicates their want of wisdom, or this privation of wisdom arises from the frequent destructions of them, so that before they become truly ancient, they become again juvenile through destruction, or it is because ancient deeds are not preserved by them, but their knowledge is always confined to present events, and such as sense apprehends. But with the Egyptians, past transactions are always present through memory, as if they were recent, and the remembrance is through history. But the history is from pillars, in which things paradoxical and worthy of admiration, whether in actions or inventions, are inscribed. Why, however, it may be said, does this priest accuse the Greeks with such severity? For what is there admirable in his narration? Since, as the noble Heraclitus says, a very learned knowledge of past transactions does not produce intellect, but if that which Eudoxus says is true, that the Egyptians call a month a year, the enumerations of many of these years will not be attended with anything wonderful. It was idle, therefore, in the Egyptian priest to think highly of himself for the knowledge of transactions in these, or, though, as Aristotle says, it is impossible that memory and sense should be effective of science, yet at the same time it must be admitted that they contribute to the reminiscence of wholes. For by relating in many things many similar circumstances, we produce one form of them, and finding frequently from history concordant apocatastasis of many things, we recur to the one cause of them. For thus the observations of the affections of the air were framed by Callippus, and the knowledge from astrology of the celestial motions, and thus much in answer to the doubt. Again, however, let us recur to the theory of wholes, and there survey the junior fabrication, held together by Minerva, and filled from more ancient and primogenial causes. For from thence this fabrication possessing stability proceeds, on account of an exempt cause, and contributes to the mundane contrariety. For everything in the demiurgic progression which is distributed into parts and multiplied, proceeds on account of that principle, as, therefore, there are causes in the world, some of which are effective of the regeneration of things, but others are guardians of the coherence of productive powers. The priest, indeed, must be assumed as analogous to these latter causes, but Solon to the former. Hence, the one exhibits a transcendent remembrance of antiquity, but the other is said to have related various mutations, generations, and corruptions. It likewise appears to me that the arrangement of the elder prior to the younger person is assumed in a way adapted to the orderly distribution of the universe, for in the fabrication of Jupiter, they have this order with reference to each other, just as the Elean guest, in Plato, says that those who live in the Saturnian period proceed from being older to being younger, but those that live in the period of Jupiter proceed in a contrary direction. And in this dialogue, Timaeus says, degrees respecting the soul, that the demiurgus produced it more ancient than the body, and on this account constituted it of a more principal nature. Now, therefore, the priest, who is the guardian of divine institutions, excels through antiquity, though that which is junior proceeds from a higher order, just as Solon comes from a city, which pertains in a greater degree to Minerva. In mundane works, however, that which is more ancient possesses a great dignity, to whom the priest, because all your souls are juvenile, neither containing any ancient opinion derived from remote tradition, nor any discipline hoary from its existence in former periods of time. Juvenility of soul, in what is here said, is analogous to renovation of life, and to more partial causes, but remote tradition, to stable intelligence, and to more ancient principles, and hoary discipline is analogous to the comprehension, which is united and always the same. of the nature and composition of all that the world contains, through which, indeed, the first and most divine of mundane natures comprehend totally and exemptly the causes of all generated beings, and eternally and antecedently contain in themselves temporal natures, but comprehend things more proximate to the universe partially and subordinately, as falling short of the unical intelligence of wholes. Hence to some of the gods hoariness is adapted, but to others juvenility, for hoariness is a symbol of intelligence and an undefiled life, and which is remote from generation, but juvenility of more partial knowledge, and which now comes into contact with generated natures. But the reason of this is the multitude and variety of destructions of the human race, which formerly have been, and again will be, the greatest of these, indeed, arising from fire and water, but the lesser from 10,000 other contingencies. In what is here said, an inquiry is made, why the Greeks are always children, but there is no discipline with them hoary from its existence in former periods of time? Or, if you wish to survey the paradigms of these things, the inquiry is, through what cause the junior fabrication presides over variety, generated natures always rising into existence, and such as are ancient becoming renovated? Before, however, he discovers the cause of such like doubts, he first discusses the periods in the universe, and points out the variety of them, of which the first principles of the gods, indeed, have an antecedent knowledge, stably and unitedly, but the second principles partially, and in such a way as to come into contact with the nature of the things which they govern. For this it is always to know what is present, but to retain in the memory things that are absent, is analogous to the perception of whole separately and stably. There are, therefore, certain various periods of things in the world, but it must be admitted that there is always generation and always corruption in the universe, for that which is sensible is rising into existence, and tending to corruption, but never truly is. This generation, however, and destruction, must be surveyed in one way in the heavens, and in another in material natures. For, in the former, a mutation of figures, and the motion of perpetually generated bodies, pre-exist, but generation, being governed through the mutations of these bodies, evolved its own circle. In this circle, however, different elements have dominion at different times, and wholes, indeed, always preserve the same and a similar order according to nature, but the different parts of these wholes subsist at different times, either conformably to nature, or preternaturally, in a becoming manner, for either the wholes and the parts always subsist according to nature, or both, on a certain time, have a preternatural subsistence, or the one has a preternatural, but the other a natural subsistence, and this in a twofold respect. If, therefore, all things perpetually existed according to nature, the variety of generation would be dissipated, perpetual natures would be the extremities of beings, and the first essences would be the last of all things. But if all things were disposed preternaturally, there would be nothing stable, from which an invariable sameness of subsistence might be present with mutable natures, nor would the circle of generation be preserved. And it is impossible that wholes should have a preternatural, but parts a natural, subsistence, for parts follow wholes, and wholes are comprehensive of parts. Hence it is impossible that the former should, at a certain time, exist preternaturally, but the latter remain in a condition conformable to nature, for neither is it possible, when the whole of our animal nature is moved, and its order destroyed, that any one of its parts should still exist according to nature. It remains, therefore, that wholes being established in a natural subsistence, the parts at one time following the wholes, are disposed conformably to nature, but at another time have a preternatural tendency. But as of partial animals, each is indeed always generated and corrupted, on account of the efflux of them in the universe, but one is more generated, and another is more corrupted than another, and one is more adapted to existence, but another to corruption. Thus also the several parts of the earth, receiving both a natural and preternatural subsistence, Some of the parts are more able to subsist conformably to nature, but others are more adapted to sustain deviations into a preternatural condition of being. This, indeed, on account of a different temperament, but afterwards on account of the position being different of different parts, and in the next place, on account of habitude to the heavens. For different parts of the earth are adapted to different parts of the heavens, though they are preserved by other figures, or configurations. And in addition to all that has been said, on account of the power of the inspective gods, and of the divinities who preside over climates, and who are allotted different peculiarities, some rejoicing more in motion, but others in permanency, some in sameness, but other in difference, abundant corruptions likewise of partial natures being produced in different places, the forms or species of the universe have an ever-failing subsistence, for man is always, the earth is always, and each of the elements always is, for since corruption and generation proceed from the celestial figures, but these are imitations of divine intellections, and the intellections are suspended from intellectual forms, but from these stability is derived. This being the case, continuity is produced in mundane forms, and the visible figures are preservative of species, but corruptive of parts, so as to cause things which are generated in time, to be also dissolved in time, according to a circular progression. For the universe does not envy salvation to such things as are able to exist in conjunction with it, but that which is incapable of being administered together with the universe, is not able to abide in it. The law of Jupiter, however, expels from essence everything of this kind as disgraceful, for it is perfectly impossible that what is disgraceful should remain in the universe, but that which is deprived of order in the universe is disgraceful. We have shown therefore why abundant and partial corruptions are produced in different places of the earth. In the next place it must be shown why the greatest of destructions are through the predominance of fire and water, and not through that of the other elements. Fire, therefore, has an efficacious and productive order in the elements, is sufficiently able to proceed through all other things, and is naturally adapted to divide them. But water is indeed moved with greater facility than earth, yet is more difficultly passive than air, and by its facility of motion, indeed, it is able to operate, but through being passive with difficulty, it is not affected by violence, nor becomes imbecile when dissipated, like air, so that it reasonably follows that violent and the greatest destructions are effected by deluges and conflagrations. You may also say that the remaining two elements are more adapted to us, for we are pedestrious and allied to earth, and as we are on all sides comprehended by air, in which we live, and which we respire, it is evident that our bodies are of a kindred nature with it. Hence these elements, as being more allied to, are less destructive of us, but the others, which are contrary to these, bring with them more violent destructions. Farther still, according to another mode of survey also, these elements earth and air, together with suffering themselves, and suffering prior to us, appear to operate on us, for air when it becomes putrid, produces pestilence, and earth when divulsed, abundant absorptions. But pestilence is a passion of air, and chasms and earthquakes are passions of earth. Fire, however, and water are able to operate on us, without being previously affected themselves, the former by permeating, but the latter by external impulsion. Hence they are capable of producing more extended destructions, as being more vigorous and powerful than the other elements, in consequence of not corrupting through being themselves distempered. Deluges, therefore, and conflagrations are the greatest destructions, but famine and pestilence, earthquakes and wars, and other such like partial calamities, may be produced from other causes, and of all these, the effective cause indeed is the order of the universe, and prior to this, the junior fabrication, which always makes new effects, and at different times produces the generation of different things. For this is asserted by the fables of the Greeks, and is indicated by the tradition of the Egyptians, which mystically says of the sun, that he assumes different forms in the signs of the zodiac. It is not, therefore, at all wonderful, if though there are many destructions, and in many places, yet man and every form always exist, through the immutable progression of divine forms, for through these, the productive principles in the universe possess an invariable sameness of subsistence, because everything which is generated from an immovable cause, is always suspended from its cause, for the relation subsisting among you, that Phaeton the offspring of the sun, on a certain time attempting to drive the chariot of his father, and not being able to keep the track observed by his parent, burnt up the natures belonging to the earth, and perished himself blasted by thunder, is indeed said to have the form of a fable, that the first principles of beings comprehend indeed things which are moved, stably, things multiplied, unitedly, partial natures, totally, and such as are divided according to time, eternally, is evident, and it is likewise well known, that theologists refer the causes of periods, and of the psychical ascents and descents, and of all multiplied and divided life, to the principles that are proximately established above the world. Hence it appears to me, that what is now said, refers the mythology about Phaeton to the Greeks, and the knowledge of Solon, for all such like corruptions and generations derive their completion from the junior fabrication, or the fabrication of the junior, or mundane gods, from which also the circulation of forms, and the variety of corporeal and psychical periods, is perfected, as, however, in divine natures, things secondary remaining, perfection is imparted to them from such as are first, thus also, the Egyptian preserving what is related by the Greeks, teaches Solon from this concerning things of which he had a knowledge prior to Solon. What therefore does this narration obscurely signify? That psychical lives, and the nature of bodies, have still multiform mutations, and over these, indeed, the supermundane powers preside, but they are connectedly comprehended by the intelligible orders of the gods, and of the former, indeed, the apparent meaning of the narration being historically delivered by the Greeks, is a symbol, but of the latter, the priest investigating the real meaning of the history, and unfolding it into light, to Solon. And thus much has been said by us for the sake of the whole theory, and in order to show that the narration is not discordant with the things proposed to be discussed. The fable respecting Phaeton, however, requires a manifold discussion, for in the first place, it is necessary to consider it historically, in the second place, physically, and in the third place, philosophically. History therefore says, that Phaeton was the offspring of the sun, and of Clymene the daughter of Ocean, and that driving the chariot of his father, he deviated from the proper track, that Jupiter also fearing for the safety of the universe, destroyed him by thunder, but he being blasted by thunder, fell about Eridanus, the fire likewise proceeding from him burnt everything that was nourished by the earth, and his sisters, the Heliades, lamented his fall, and such is the historical account of the fable. It is, however, necessary to admit that a conflagration took place, for the whole narration is introduced for the sake of this, and, also, that the cause of it is neither an impossibility, nor a certain thing which may easily happen, but it will be impossible if someone fancies that the sun at one time drives his own chariot, and at another time being changed ceases to drive it, and commits his proper employment to another. And it will be among the number of things which may be easily accomplished, if it is supposed that this Phaeton was a comet, which being dissolved produced an intolerable dryness from vehement heat, for this supposition is generally adopted. Porphyry therefore says, that certain signs may be assumed from the motion of comets, for when its motion is towards the southern parts, it is indicative of tempests, towards the north, of dryness from excessive heat, towards the east, of pestilence, and towards the west, of fertility. The disappearance likewise of the comet, is said to be the destruction by thunder. If, however, it be requisite to dissolve the fable in a more physical way, it is better to adopt the explanation of our associate Dominus, that sometimes so great a quantity of dry exhalation is collected together, as to be easily enkindled by the solar heat. But this being enkindled, It is not at all wonderful that it should burn all that part of the earth which is situated under it, and produce such a conflagration as that of which the fable speaks. In consequence, therefore, of the inflammation being produced by the sun, the authors of fables, when induced to call Phaeton the offspring of the sun, denominating this offspring a male, on account of the efficacy of the power of fire, and because likewise it is usual to call fire a male, in the same manner as earth a female, and to denominate the one matter, but the other form. But because this exhalation did not proceed in a path parallel to that of the sun, mythologists assert that Phaeton did not drive the chariot conformably to the track of his father. The dissolution of the cloud about the earth was called by them the fall of Phaeton, and the extinction of this cloud the thundering of Jupiter. But the abundance of rain after the extinction of the cloud, for this takes place after great conflagrations, is the lamentation of the sisters, or the wet exhalations. Inasmuch as those that weep pour forth moisture, and the exhalations, both the dry and the wet, have one cause, the sun, but to the latter the female pertains, and to the former the male. These explanations, therefore, are more physical. It is however possible that the fable may indicate something more sublime, that partial souls proceed indeed from the Father of wholes, but are disseminated about the mundane gods, in order that they may not only be intellectual, come into contact with intelligibles, and recede from bodies, but also that they may have a mundane hypostasis, as, therefore, divine and demoniacal souls are arranged under secondary leaders, some indeed under the divinity of the earth, others under the moon, and others under the sun, some under the government of Jupiter, but others under that of Mars. That which is disseminated being of divine origin, everywhere receives something from the nature of that in which it is sown, just as things sown in the earth receive something from the earth, but those sown in an animal receive something from the nature of the animal, so that of offspring, some express the peculiarity of places, but others the similitude of the mother. Hence also, souls that are disseminated about their kindred stars receive a certain peculiarity of life from their leaders, so that each is not only soul, but a soul of a certain kind, such for instance as martial, or Jovian, or lunar. For whether the god is of an immutable characteristic, or is demiurgic, or vivific, a certain representation of the peculiarity of the allotted deity accedes to the souls that are arranged under it. And why is this wonderful? Since the peculiarity of presiding gods extends as far as to herbs and stones, and there is a stone, and also a herb suspended from the solar power, whether you are willing to call them heliotropes, or by any other name, a similar reasoning likewise must be extended to the other gods. Of these souls therefore, those indeed that are undefiled, remain always suspended from the gods to whom they are allied, and govern the universe in conjunction with them. But others descend, yet are not filled with genesiurgic vice, or the depravity which is offspring of the realms of generation, and others receive a certain defilement from the subjects of their government, for this is the last form of life. The first of these souls, therefore, are truly sons of the gods, as not proceeding out of their fathers, being, as it were, fashioned by and remaining within them, running before the gods, and having the order of guards or attendants. The souls that have the middle rank are indeed called sons of the gods, but receive also a secondary life, and become the sons of gods and men. And souls of the third rank are also sons of the gods, but are not called genuine sons, as not preserving the form of their proper god, but verge to matter, and become oblivious of their genuine fathers. Whether, therefore, the authors of fables call Timaeus the son of earth, or Phaeton the offspring of the sun, or Musaeus the son of the moon, they thus denominate them after this manner, and others differently conformably to the before-mentioned causes. With respect to other sons of the gods, however, we shall elsewhere speak